The book of Revelation. The resurrected Christ appears to the Apostle John and tells him to write down what he sees and send it to the 7 churches. John presents his outline for the book, the things that are happening and the things that will happen later. John, the beloved, is the apostle who receives this extended heavenly message. The source of the message is the Father. The Father gave the message to the Son, verse 1. The Son gave the message to an angel, and the angel gave the message to the Apostle John, verses 1 and 2. The promise in this message is a very special blessing that is promised if you obey the contents and if you read it. If you hear and read the contents, he says you will receive a special blessing. The recipients of this message are the 7 churches found in Asia Minor. The letter opens up with a greeting in this message, verse 4 and 5. The message is from the Father, from the sevenfold Spirit, and from the Son. The theme of this message is found in verses 5 through 8. Jesus Christ is the grand and glorious theme. The whole book is centered around him. Who is he? Well, he's described in verse 5 as being God's faithful witness. He's also described as being the firstborn from the dead, ruler of the kings of this earth, the Alpha and Omega, verse 8, and the Eternal One, in verse 8b. What did Jesus do? According to verse 5e, he shed his blood to redeem us. According to verse 6, he made us a kingdom of priests. What will he do? He will come again in the clouds, revealing himself to the Jews, verse 7, and then revealing himself to the Gentiles, verse 7. The place of this message is the Isle of Patmos. John was placed there because he was receiving punishment for being faithful to God. He was on the island of Patmos to bear witness to this message, to receive this message. He was in prison. But God set him aside to give him the book of Revelation. Well, this message is all about the day of the Lord. The place of this message, John was on the island of Patmos. The time of this message, it was the Lord's day. And the sound of this message was a voice like a trumpet blast, according to verse 10. John is instructed to send a message to the 7 churches in Asia. His appearance, he appears standing among 7 golden lampstands, verses 12 through 13. He is wearing a long robe with a golden band across the chest, verse 13b. His hair is white like snow, verse 14a. His eyes are like blazing fire, verse 14b. His feet are like brownish brass, verse 15a. His voice thunders like mighty ocean waves, verse 15d. Verse 15b. His right hand holds 7 stars. Out of his mouth comes a double-edged sword, verse 16. And his face shines as the noonday sun, verse 16. He gives John reassurance. Words of comfort are found in verses 17 through 18. He reassures the fear-stricken John. I was dead, but I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and the grave. And then he clarifies as he explains the lampstands and the stars as to what they represent. He said the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches, verse 20, and the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, verses 19 through 20. John writes the words of Christ to the first 4 churches. The first church is a church in Ephesus, verses 1 through 7. Jesus is seen to be a counselor. He holds the 7 stars and walks among the 7 lampstands. He gives this church commendation in verses 2 and 3 and verse 6. He says, through hard work and patience, the church has performed many righteous deeds, verse 2 of chapter 2. They do not tolerate sin in the church, according to verse 2. They allow only sound doctrine to be taught, verse 2c. They have suffered for Jesus, verse 3. They hate the practice of the Nicolaitans, verse 6. The chastening that they receive comes because they have left their first love. He counsels them in verse 5, and the procedure that's involved is laid out. He says they are to remember their first love. They are to repent, and they are to return to their first love, verse 5. The penalty, if it does not happen, their lampstand will be removed. In other words, their effectiveness for the cause of Christ will be removed. The challenge comes in verse 7. Jesus promises all overcomers would receive fruit from the tree of life in paradise. Chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, he gives a message to the church at Smyrna. Jesus is seen as a counselor in verse 8. Jesus says he is the first and the last, who was dead and is alive forevermore. The commendation comes in verse 9. They are persecuted and poor, yet they are rich. They have been slandered by those belonging to Satan himself, verse 9. The chastening, we don't find any chastening of this church. They are to remain faithful unto death, and they will receive the crown of life. He gives them a challenge. They will not be hurt by the second death. He moves on from the church in Smyrna to the church in Pergamos, verses 12 through 17. As counselor, Jesus still carries his two-edged sword. He gives them commendation in verse 13. They remain faithful even though living in Satan's headquarters, verse 13. One of their members, Antipas, had become a martyr. He gives them chastening in verses 14 through 15. They are tolerating the teachings of Balaam, verse 14. They are also tolerating the teaching of the Nicolaitans, chapter 2, verse 15. He gives them counsel. They are to repent or be punished, in verse 16. He gives them a challenge in verse 17. They are to be partakers of the hidden manna, and they are to be given a white stone with a new name, verse 17. He moves on from the church in Pergamos, and he goes to the church in Thyatira, verses 18 through 29. He gives them counsel. Jesus' eyes are as a blazing fire, and his feet are like polished bronze. He gives them a commendation. He says their works, love, faith, and patience have greatly increased. But he gives them chastening in verses 20 through 23 because they allowed some wickedness in their church. They are allowing a false prophetess named Jezebel to teach immoral and idolatrous teachings. The warning is found in verses 21 through 23. Unless they repent, both she and her followers will suffer both sickness and death. The counsel that Jesus gives, he tells them the faithful must hold on to what they have. The challenge is found in verses 26 through 29. They will help move over the nations. They will be given the morning star. And then we go to the third chapter of the book of Revelation. Christ speaks to the final three churches. The church in Sardis, the church in Philadelphia, and the church in Laodicea. When speaking to the church in Sardis, verses 1 through 6, Jesus as counselor tells them that he holds the seven spirits of God and the seven stars. He gives them commendation in verse 4 of chapter 3. There are some in the church that have not soiled their garments with sin. He gives them chastisement by way of verses 1 through 2. They have a reputation for being alive, but they are dead. Their deeds are far from right in God's sight. Verse 2. He gives them counsel. They are to remember, repent, watch, and wait, lest Jesus comes upon them as a thief in the night. He gives them a challenge. They will be dressed in white. Verse 5. And their names will be announced before the Father and his angels. Verses 5 through 6. Moving from the church in Sardis, he moves to the church in Philadelphia. Verses 7 through 13 of chapter 3. Jesus as counselor tells them the holy and true Jesus holds the keys of David. Verse 7. He opens doors and closes open doors. Verse 7. The commendation is found in verse 8. Though they are weak, they have kept his word. Verse 8. They have not denied his name. No chastening, no chastisement is given to this church. He gives them counsel in verse 11. Hold on to what you have so that no one will take your crown. He gives them a challenge in verses 9 through 10 and also verses 12 through 13. Their enemies will fall down before them. Verse 9. They will be kept from the hour of trial. Verse 10. They will become pillars in the temple of God. Verse 12. They will be given new names. Verses 12 through 13. And then finally, he addresses the church in Laodicea in verses 14 through 22 of this third chapter. As counselor, Jesus tells him he is the faithful and true witness, the ruler of God's creation. He doesn't give this church any commendations. He offers chastisement in verses 15 through 17. The fallacies that they're caught up in, he has to address. He says this church boasts of their riches and concludes they stand in need of nothing. The fact of the matter is, in verse 17, God views them as wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. The fury is found in verses 15 through 16, because the church is neither hot nor cold. God threatens to spit them out of his mouth unless they repent. He gives them counsel. In verse 18, they are to seek spiritual clothing from God to cover their nakedness. They are to seek spiritual medicine from God to heal their blindness. Verse 18. The challenge is found in verses 19 through 22. After their severe rebuke, God reassures the Laodiceans. Verse 19, he rebukes them because he loves them. Verse 20, he promises to enter into their hearts if they allow him. And then in verses 21 through 22, he says he will prepare a place for them on his throne. This is the church where Jesus walks out of and stands at the door and knocks. And he says, if any man let me in, I will come in and fellowship with him. So this is the church that basically put Jesus out. Or they either put him out or he walked out. I wonder if Jesus is in your church. Well, as we summarize these 7 churches, I just want to drive home the fact that they were all located in Asia Minor. And at this time, I'd like to just point out the words of Jesus in quotations to them. To Pergamum, he said, I have a few things against you. Thyatira, he says, hold on to what you have until I come. To Smyrna, he says, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. To Sardis, he said, you have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. To Philadelphia, he says, I have placed you before an open door. To the Ephesians, he said, you have forsaken your first love. To the Laodiceans, he said, you are lukewarm. Well, I hope that this study has helped you, and I pray that you will go back and read and study these passages, Revelation chapter 1 through chapter 3. I pray that God would bless you richly, as he has already said he would do, if we read the words of this prophecy, and if we keep them. God is going to pour us out these special blessings. Be blessed, my brothers and sisters.